and whatever lies beyond it is the unknown, the uninterpretable.
Talent does not justify morally or ethically wrong behavior.
Consumer of art must realize that
I think art takes a life of its own, independent from the artist.
if the music is good, I accept. If the music is not to my expectations, I don't.
They also try to force their ideologies into the consumers.
Can we ever truly experience a novel from the author's viewpoint?
Why does this work appeal to me?
Hello, welcome once again to another session of our Media Discourse, produced by the Department of Mass Communication and Journalism, Siliguri College. Today, Dr. Abu Mounir will host a discussion on a very interesting literary topic, separating the art from the artist, with our students. Does art have an independent existence separate from the artist? Is the artist bound by the idealistic parameters of his work? These and other critical issues of this vexed question will be discussed at length in this video. I'm sure you will be enjoying it. Thank you.
Hello, welcome once again to yet another episode of our Media Discourse. It has been quite some time since we produced our last video. However, we were quite occupied with our semester classes and internal exams. Anyway, better late than never. We're here, and today we're going to discuss a very interesting topic, though not directly related to media theory as far as the syllabi is concerned, but nevertheless a very interesting topic which I'm sure it concerns anyone who consumes art. The topic today is separating the art from the artist. And with me today, we'll be discussing this very interesting topic. We have Prashidha Chetri, student of 4th SEM, Shaunab Sanyal, 4th SEM, Titisha Shah, 4th SEM, and very happy to have senior student Rachana Chetri from 6th SEM, Ved Malay from 4th SEM, and we also have Devushmita Pal, who's a student of English major, but she is also a student of mass comm minor, and we're going to have her speak on this very interesting topic of the art vis-a-vis the artist. Consumers and connoisseurs of art, they often have this tendency to associate the artist with his work in a wholesome manner. And they fail to recognize that there is a subtle and a nuanced difference between the entity of the artist, his persona, his personality, with his work, often leads to huge expectations and, certain norms of conduct from the artist, which puts a lot of pressure on the artist. On this issue, I'd like to speak to Prashidha. Prashidha, if you could give us your views on this complex issue of the failure to distinguish the entity of art from the artist, from the created with the creator.
Thank you, sir. When we're talking about the art and the artist, I think that this is one of the most important conversations that needs to take place and that needs to be discussed, especially among today's masses. Because when we think about the art, we think about the created. And when we think about the artist, we think about the creator. Now, the distinction between the creator and the created is very important. Because oftentimes it so happens is that the best things, a masterpiece, is often made by a madman. I would like to take an example of Kanye West, sir. A contemporary artist. We can look at his hits like Flashing Lights, Stronger, and Gentleman from Paris. Now, when we think about it, sir, his music is amazing. When we hear his opinions and what he has to say, we may think differently of him. If I take my example, sir, before I knew about Kanye's opinions, I listened to his music strictly. I didn't know who he was as an artist or as a person, because I only cared for his music. After I heard about his opinions, it made me think differently of him. I was a Kanye fan, and to a certain extent I still am, but I know how to make a distinction between his music and Kanye as a person. This is what people lack into this world. critical thinking especially. We discussed in our last topic as well. They cannot think properly because the people are either too quick to brush his music off just because of his opinion, or they're just too quick to defend him mindlessly and his opinions and everything else, which might give a sense of an encouragement to others to continue the bad things and the bad opinions that he presents. So this is what I'd like to say about Kanye in general, sir. And when we talk about the art and the artist, I especially think that it's important for people themselves, especially, to make a distinction between them, to distinguish between them. That's what I have to say, sir. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it sort of reminds me of a great sportsman, Diego Maradona. If you can consider sports also as a medium of art in some sense. Maradona, the footballer, and Maradona, the drug addict, the personality. I think there was this huge issue of somehow the fans getting very angry with Maradona, just missing the point altogether, because our relation with Maradona relates to football. It has nothing to do with his personal life. And I think this example sort of should extend to artists as well. And we should realize, even for artists whose intent is very ideological or say moralistic, and in the personal lives they somehow fail to keep up to those standards which they appear to propagate in their art, well, that shouldn't be taken as a point against him or lead to some bias or prejudice against him. We must remember that famous artists, and especially in this age of mass media, the popular, hugely popular artists, it's very difficult for them to keep their normalcy in the face of the huge adulation which they receive from the masses. After all, they are human beings. Yeah. So with this, we go to Sharnab Sanyal. Sharnab has some very interesting ideas to share. Yes, Sharnab.
So, thank you, sir, for handing the mic over to me. The art and the artist, understanding this symbiosis, it has a lot of superlatives, just very basic ideas can not be as pristine as they appear. They cannot be as clear and distilled as they appear. So to understand this, we have to go way back to the ideas of what is intent. Intent through language, intent through ideas. What do you mean by your ideologues that are being translated through your mouth? What do these intents occupy? So through intent, I like to take the example of pejorative insult or slurs. So whenever you talk about slurs in general, you try to say that maybe if you say the slur without any intention of doing it, without any ideation of doing it, but then slurs in and itself are a form of insult against, and they have a lot of communal connotations that have been vilified throughout history, and it's a subject of reclaim for the people who have been on the receiving end of it. So it's not something that you can use, and you can't really talk about intent. If you push someone by mistake, you can't say that it wasn't your intention to push them. You tripped and then you just pushed them, and you're like, oh, but it wasn't in my intention, it wasn't in my focus. But then the other person is still getting hurt. So I guess you can't really bring up intent in cases where your actions and your repercussions are clearly visible to everyone. So this basic idea is very important to understand, the relationships between the art and the artist, how complex it can get, how enmeshed it can get through different ideas, just getting murked by different perspectives, different biases, different partition biases. So I talk about the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein talks about language and the limits of language, the limits of what we can see, what we can perceive, and what we can interpret. He tries to attest this interpretation to the limits of our words, through the limits of our language. So whatever we speak, whatever we denote, whatever we say as syllables through our mouth, these are things that we can interpret rationally, and whatever lies beyond it is the unknown, the uninterpretable, the things that we cannot understand, the world that we haven't discovered yet. When we think about the world in general, what do we think about? We think of the macrocosmic world, or do we think of our own interpersonal microcosmic world? When we talk about the macrocosmic world, we are talking about a world that is so far beyond our reason, so far beyond our understanding. We can't really cross over to the other side of the continent. We can't really understand that. So Wittgenstein says that the things that we cannot understand are not perceivable by us and thus not translatable through language. And a lot of the people, a lot of the other like zeitgeists of that era, zeitgeist philosophers, zeitgeist thought experiments of that era, like the Hempel's Raven and the Vienna Circle, they used to follow his ideations, like his ideologues about language and like the limits of it, how a person's intent should be clear in like the way he phrases, he monologues about himself. So yeah, that happened. And then Wittgenstein came about, and then he realized he made a grave mistake in his works, because there are things which we don't interpret, things that we feel, things that we don't understand, and yet we can still turn it into art through language, through very abstract art, not the like definition of words, geometry, mathematics, but through art, through abstract art that flows beyond boundaries, art that has no demarcation. Those are the corrections that Wittgenstein made later on in his work, in his modifications of his first work, which was Tractus. And then we turn to the ideas of Emily Dickinson, someone who champions, who touts about humanity's idea to interpret, humanity's idea to make ideas for themselves. So Emily Dickinson talks about, and as I cite her verbatim, so the ideas of like whether God and our relation to God, how do we perceive God and how do we bring about that entire idea of creation within ourselves? Because creation is something that is not only permissible for God. We create in His image as well. So thinking about God and us, Emily Dickinson says that our difference from God is the same as sound as syllable. Our brain is wider than the sky. Our brain lurks deeper than the sea, and it just absorbs everything like a sponge in a bucket. So, and she also champions the ideas of like possibility. Like, I dwell in the house of possibility, the house of ideas, the house of creation. So thinking about this, like we human beings have been designated as a very mimetic, someone who morose, very mimetic, an imposter, someone who imitates life, someone who imitates nature, tries to reach as close as we can to God's pedestal. So that is what we human beings are doing. We are the weak gods of interpretation. When we look back on our life, when we reach a dead end, we try to look back on how much we have decorated those around us, and beneath our footprints we also notice another set of footprints, and those are the footprints of God, the God that exists within us, the world that exists within us. So these worlds, our own personal worlds, from there comes a desire to understand other people, because you can't present art without having an audience. A story only becomes a story when there's a reader who reads it, when it's someone who reaches, when there's someone out there who resonates with your work. Without an audience, your work is just a nonsensical syllable. But yeah, that brings about the idea of like just your artist's intention and like the artist writing about their works, their opuses.
Yes, very true. That's a very interesting observation which you make regarding art is really nothing without the audience. Another very significant aspect is that the audience, the readers, for instance, in case of literature, they somehow draw meaning and contribute to an independent entity of the work of art, which is distinct from the artist. For instance, I'm very fond of reading, say, Dostoevsky's work, obviously in English translation. But Dostoevsky lived 200 years back, if I'm not mistaken, a little less than 200 years back. Now, the world of Dostoevsky, technically, socially, economically, geographically, it was quite different from the digital age in which we live today. And why does his work, which has a time context, which has a geographical context, and a social and political context, why does his work appeal to me? Is it because I have a special interest for, Russian life or Russian literature? Not exactly. It's because I draw meaning from Dostoevsky's work, which may not have been intended in the manner which I draw the meaning, in the manner which I understand. So I have made Dostoevsky my own, in my own context, and when I could relate to him in my own specific way. And this is a very crucial factor which gives an independent existence to the work of art and a distinct feature, a feature which distinguishes the art from the artist. And with this, we'd like to go to Tidisha. What interesting things she would like to contribute to this idea about separating the artist from his work of art. Over to Tidisha.
I think this is when the issue of Kanye West brings about the question of idealism into play. I think when us as audience or viewers or consumers of art, when we appreciate talent to such a degree, we tend to idolize the creator. Even though that might be justifiable to a degree, because of course, as consumers, when we're appreciating the art, and if we believe art to be an extension of the artist, we naturally have a sense of appreciation towards the artist as well. But with extreme idolization, what happens is something that, of course, Kanye West fans are also, I believe, experiencing at the moment: cognitive dissonance. What happens there is when we become such worshippers of the artist, we tend to forget that talent does not justify morally or ethically wrong behavior. No matter what the masterpiece is, no matter how critically acclaimed it is, it in any form or way does not justify immoral or unethical behavior. This is something that I think even Virginia Woolf tried to point out in her book, where she says, wise men never speak what they truly think about women. Are they doing that as an armor? Are they doing that in a way to protect their true values so as to not seem to be something that they are not trying to project through their art? But again, the argument that Oscar Wilde tried to bring is that all art is essentially useless. And, you give a man a mask and that's when he truly speaks the truth. So we can bring that argument that yes, art can be separated from the artist in that sense, in the sense of its aesthetic value. But at the end of the day, it cannot be denied that if we consume art, if we appreciate art, it automatically benefits the artist. I think with that sort of justification, how much can be justified? How much immoral behavior can be justified just by talent? I think that is an important and intriguing discourse to have. And it's time that we value these blind justifications that we make towards people just because of sheer talent. Thank you, sir.
Yes, thank you, Tidisha, very well expressed. And yes, a very important point which you make is that the issue of excessive, idolization, where people, whether it's even in the case of sports or, in film stars, especially in music, and somehow the audience, they sort of, externalize their own value systems into the artist whom they love, whom he or she loves. And that is where the problem begins, because, the synchronization of ideas, of thoughts, and the convergence of, sentiments might work a lot in this excessive over-idolization. But at the end of the day, the consumer of art must realize that the artist is a separate individual altogether. And also there is this issue of consistency. How do we expect people to remain consistent across a long period of time? Nobody has that level of consistency, neither are we. But we are not put to scrutiny because we are not on the public forum. The artist is. Sometimes we do hear, but this was the man who was saying so and so stuff 10 years back. But 10 years is a long time, and opinions change, and change is the only thing permanent. So these are the aspects which have to be kept in mind while engaging with the topic or expecting consistent conduct from popular singers or artists. And with this, we'd like to also ask Rachana Chetri. Rachana, you probably have some useful, ideas on this topic. Is it valid to sort of distinguish the work of art from the artist himself? Right? Over to Rachana.
Thank you, sir, for providing me the opportunity to be a part of this discussion with the topic of separating art from the artist. So, separating art from artist is like judging a cake solely on its taste and texture, regardless of the baker's personality. The merit of the artwork stands independent, separate from the individuals who created them. The personal life of the artist is seen as an external factor, irrelevant to the work's inherent value. For instance, a powerful grief painting done by an artist can move a person deeply without them having much knowledge about the artist himself, about his personal life, his losses. So, I think art takes a life of its own, independent from the artist. However, sir, oftentimes what happens is when we know too much about the artist, about his background, we tend to start seeing the art, the things he created, with the lens of the artist's life. Sometimes negatively, sometimes positively, which somehow influences our perspective. Like, for example, I would like to give my own personal experience with Kafka's work, Metamorphosis. Before reading the book, I read about Kafka's biography and I learned about his complex relationship with his father and his mental struggles. So when I actually started reading the book, I found myself sympathizing with the artist more and seeing him. Like, I felt like he put himself in the shoes of Grigor Samsa and presented the story in a fiction way. And my perspective kind of overshadowed in appreciating the aesthetic value of the story itself. So given this, I would like to ask, where do we draw the line, deciding whether or not to separate the art from the artist? Thank you, sir.
Yeah, that's a very pertinent question which you've just put about where exactly do we draw the line. I mean, it's not easy to say, especially in popular art, for instance, in cinema, in popular songs, initially it is the work of art which makes the artist popular, and endearing to his followers, his singers. This, sort of gets to a point where the fans, the fandom, the huge world of fandom, they sort of put a lot of pressure on the artist himself. And if he has to face, and deal with that, there's another issue that obsessive idolizing often leads to other works, consequent works of art by the same artist, which are of no merit. But somehow they too are, hailed as great works of art. They too become popular because of this obsession, not necessarily because of the inherent merit in the art. This is something which, the big film stars, often they get away with very badly made films because of this hero obsession in Hollywood as well as in the Hindi film industry. Now, so where do we draw the line? Now, I think one of the ways would be to, for instance, as I just mentioned, Dostoevsky. When I read Dostoevsky, I never had any inkling, of who he was. And it was a blank sheet. I started from a blank sheet, and that's a very good thing to do, in this age of promotion and advertising, even literature is promoted nowadays, So what happens is that promotional aspect, the name and the fame has an impact, has a, puts you in a position of predisposition, that what you are going to, you have expectations, you make yourself prepared, But when you start with a blank sheet and then you like the work of art, then you can be sure that you like the work because of the art, because you have no knowledge about the artist. Okay. And for serious connoisseurs, for serious consumers of art, I mean, this should be a problem where to draw line, and also to ensure that his work of art may not always necessarily be reflected in his conduct at each and every moment. There's a distinction between recognition and glamour, recognition and obsession. So once you, as a consumer of art, you are prepared to accept art entirely on the basis of art. If the music is good, I accept. If the music is not to my expectations, I don't, irrespective of who the singer is. And this is a very good approach to take when you're actually in a position of engaging with the artist due to his work, right? And to throw more idea on this very interesting but complex issue, we have Ved Malay of 4th Sem. Ved, please come up with whatever you have to say on this issue of art and the artist.
Thank you, sir. I would love to speak on this topic about separating art from the artist. I think there is no rigid answer to this, whether the art is separate from the artist or inseparable from the artist, because art itself is just an extension of the artist, and we can get to know a lot about the artist's personality, their way of thinking, a lot about them just through their art alone. And in these times, some artists who have done more immoral deeds try to like glorify, justify, and normalize their acts of immoral deeds through their art. And they also try to force their ideologies into the consumers, the people who indulge in their art. And the question is, how much of it is acceptable to like glorify it and justify it? Because not everyone has the critical thinking to like question them or think whether this person is right or wrong. If they listen to a song and they like it, they certainly start to idealize that singer or artist and think that everything that they say is right. And so I feel like there should be some regulations and censorship regarding this matter of art. That's all.
But actually, I don't think it's really an issue of censorship here. It's essentially a matter between the producer of art and the consumer. That is basically between the writer and the reader in case of literature. I don't think there's any third agency as such. And yes, talking about literature, we have Devoshmita Pal from the Department of English, who's doing major in English, and she also has a minor paper in mass comm. So I would be very happy to have Devoshmita's take on this issue of art versus, separating the art from the artist. All right, over to Devoshmita.
I'm extremely grateful to be having this opportunity to speak on the topic of separating the art from the artist. It's an extremely growing question nowadays. Like, can we separate the art from the artist? Whether we consider it to be the literature of Fyodor Dostoevsky or Kanye West's music. While some argue that the artist's misdeeds should not tame the appreciation of his work, while others believe that the moral context of their behavior and their influence is necessarily inseparable. So talking about one of my favorites, Fyodor Dostoevsky, he is one of the greatest Russian novelists of the 19th century. We are aware of some of his works like Crime and Punishment, The Brothers Karamazov, The Idiot, Notes from Underground, etc., which explores deep questions of morality, suffering, guilt, and faith. As we read more of Dostoevsky's work, we get to know about his characters being more complex, full of inner struggles, and his unique style gives voice to so many different viewpoints. That's why people all around the world still admire and read his works. He also promoted Russian nationalism and often wrote about women in ways that idealize their suffering and their submission. So now the big question is, should these personal views change the way we perceive and admire his work? There could be two sides. One being where we actually separate the art from the artist. They say that Dostoevsky's novels are open-ended and his insights into guilt, alienation, and search for meaning are timeless and resonate across cultures and generations. Even when his personal beliefs show up, they are often challenged by other characters. That's why his work has therefore had profound influence on philosophers like Nietzsche, Camus, and Freud. While on the other hand, critics say it's not very easy. They argue that Dostoevsky's views, especially his anti-Semitism and his religious nationalism, do show up in subtle ways in his fiction. His strict moral ideas often reflect a strict Orthodox Christian view he had, especially against the Jewish communities where he thought they were being economically exploited, and portrayed them as mirrors of materialism and pride. What's more is that his work has sometimes been used by extreme nationalist groups to be set as an example that followed his ideologies. But also there's one deeper issue I would like to talk about, that can we ever truly experience a novel from the author's viewpoint? Because editors, translators, and even censorship all shape what we read. So the book which we are even reading right now might not directly influence what Dostoevsky wanted to put out in his work. So where does this leave us now? Maybe the answer isn't to fully separate the art from the artist, but we can recognize Dostoevsky as a genius while also confronting the part of his thinking which we think might harm the society or people's viewpoint While we read Dostoevsky's work, we not only challenge ourselves to admire his character, but also to critically think about the values that it portrays to us. In the end, I would like to say great art often comes from flawed people, and our job as readers isn't just to enjoy, but also to reflect, to understand, and to question ourselves. This separating the art from the artist would neither be a complete rejection or a blind admiration, but it should rather be a critical engagement where we do consider and acknowledge the brilliance of their work while we become mindful of the ideologies they carry or conceal. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, very well explained. But, regarding the issue which you said, are we really getting what the author wants to say due to the issue of editing, some degree of maybe censorship editing, whatever, gatekeeping as we call it in strictly mass communication terms. But even if there was no editing and even if there was no, substantial, gatekeeping, we would still read Dostoevsky or any other author in our own way, in our own specific context, okay, which may be quite different from the context in which the words were written, okay. So, in fact, I do remember during my college life when I read White Nights, very distinct memory. I was very moved by the novel. I read it around 1990, around the time I was in my final year in college. And quite clearly, my time and my, context, socio-political context was quite different from Dostoevsky's when he wrote the story. But I could relate to it. Now, whether I was actually grasping or I was actually reading Dostoevsky wholesomely, I don't think that's very important. Maybe I was, decoding Dostoevsky in my own way, according to my own specific socio-cultural context and in my own time frame. So that's that. And the other complex issue which you mentioned was about morally problematic viewpoints or, thought patterns of Dostoevsky, especially with regard to his what would be construed today as anti-Semitic Jews. By the same yardstick, we could still call Shakespeare anti-Semitic because of the way he characterizes Shylock in The Merchant of Venice. But the one big problem in such characterization is the tendency, which many of us have, of sort of, judging situations, personalities who lived 200 or more years back, quite some time back, more than 2 or 3 centuries back. The tendency to judge them on today's moral plane, in today's, on the basis of today's values, present-day values. This actually is the real issue, not so-called problematic thought patterns or problematic, way in which Dostoevsky addresses some issues relating to religion or relating to religious identity. And the same applies to Shakespeare as well, right? And with that, we come to the end of the 3rd episode of our Media Discourse. I'm sure all of us really enjoyed this brainstorming session, especially our dear students. And I'd like to thank them for their participation as well as to Abhidan Subba and Prashant Tamang, who are in the production team. I'd also like to thank my colleagues Jyoti Shah and Professor Angana Chakraborty and Shonima Das, who were also part of this endeavor from the Department of Mass Communication and Journalism in Siliguri College. And we look forward to your comments, and also would like to inform you that the next video in this Media Discourse series will be coming maybe in a month's time, because we'll soon be having the semester exams. But this is a project which is going to continue, if not on a very regular basis, but it's going to continue. And I'm really looking forward to your feedback, to your encouragement. And if you have anything to comment, all you have to do is to put in your words in the comment section. Till our next video, goodbye, and we really hope that you enjoyed this discussion as much as it was a pleasure for us to present it before you. Thank you.